Ladies and gentlemen, Gary Hoberman.
Thanks, John. It has been an honor learning from leaders like John and just being part of this organization. The thing that I loved most about the shed is adaptability. The building moves. It's not fixed. And when you think the example we always use in software is like building a house. It's fixed. You can't change it after. And like Uncork, the building represents that adaptability. And you're going to hear me use a lot of ilities today. So we always talk enterprise software with ilities. You'll see a lot of that as we go through this today. To start with, we talk a lot about the cloud. And what's interesting is you're in a plane, you're taking off, the excitement of that trip. Where are you going to? When you get actually into the cloud, it's probably the most boring part because you can't see anything. It's opaque. When you get above the clouds, you're going to be able to see far and wide. And our hope throughout the day today is to show you a glimpse into the future based on a present which is completely transformational. I want to thank everyone here as well as thank everyone yesterday who, we had customers yesterday, hundreds of them, some flowing as far as Switzerland to be with us, who shared their own experiences using Uncork. And everyone talks about as a software company, and again, for those who know me, I'm not your software CEO. I still view myself more on the corporate side as a CIO. And I still think in those terms. So every software company talks about the licensing and the volume and the usage and this. And very few actually talk about the value. What I heard yesterday, time and time again, is the most amazing customers on the forefront of their industry talking about value. And it was exhilarating to see that. So with that, welcome to Unqork Create. It's going to be an amazing day today, and I'll walk you through as well as we go through this. And thank you, John. Thank you, Netta, for kicking this off. When you think about what we're doing at Uncork, it starts 5 years ago, where, to believe or not, 5 years ago to this day, we opened payroll. And the first employee, as we actually opened payroll, and that money that we were paying was based on revenue, not funding. It was based on clients' value and clients where we're driving from. What's unique about Uncork, not just that aspect of it, was those earliest employees through where we are today with 500 employees. And this journey of these last 5 years, we were always called a rocket ship from the earliest days. Even the clients we met is, you guys, you're a rocket ship. What's unique about Uncork and the way we think of ourselves is we're a rocket ship, but our customers are actually inside that rocket ship with us. And our team is building this rocket ship. And most importantly, the fuel that's driving this rocket ship in the air is your requirements. It's you, the customers, pushing us forward and driving where we are. So when we think about just this past year, what we've accomplished, dynamic grids, crazy concept we've heard all along. My business wants to work on Uncork the way they work in Excel. We built a grid component, which is so powerful, you could visualize data, transform data, change it. And that was live earlier this year. Dynamic workflows. Workflows that could basically do parallelization. I have never seen a BPM tool capture the value it intended to do in my life. In every Fortune 50 company. We built a workflow engine in Uncork better than every BPM engine out there because it's practical. It understands it's not about a human to human, it's about a human to machine to human to machine. And by the way, it all should happen parallel, not sequential. And dynamic modules where you could now, just in time, bring your logic into the UI, into the API, into the server to basically execute it with a performance of utmost speed where we could handle volume. One customer that went live this last year, a very large state in the United States, they wouldn't go live until we could demonstrate 100,000 concurrent users, which was every man, woman, and child of the state going into Uncork in 1 hour and applying for rent relief, mortgage relief, COVID funds. We demonstrated that. We achieved it. And it is amazing what we've been able to do. So with that said, it's been amazing when we look back at the past. We are so proud of where we've come to. And again, this is thanks to you and everyone in the room. We're proud of the accomplishments we've been able to drive. Everyone reads about funding rounds, and not recently, but in the past, funding rounds and the excitement around it. That's not how we think about Uncork. So we think about it is, what if a technology was so magical you could accomplish anything? There's no more barriers to change. There's no more holding the business back and the value back. When I look at the slide and say where we've impacted value, in 5 days, we worked with the city we're sitting in, New York City, and we stood up an entire food delivery program covered in Wall Street Journal, whereby a consumer at home needs food. Senior citizen needs food. Child needs food. Can't go out of the house to get it. Shelters are closed. Centers are closed. They're able to request it, a routing to a hub. National Guard puts the food in the box, loads it into a taxi. We're paying that taxi driver for 3 routes, which we calculated optimal based in Uncork. And now they deliver the food. 2 million food orders were delivered through Uncork. That's a value. That's what, in 5 days to create that application with New York City. In addition, if anyone got married recently in New York City, it was Uncork. It was called Project Cupid. And what's amazing about that is not the 38,000 people married last year in our system, where we replaced COBOL. So talk about cloud migration. I've got a COBOL system. We moved them to the cloud in Uncork in 5 days. From scratch, shutting down COBOL. And we are their system of record. What's amazing about that is, again, not that it was accomplished in 5 days. I met a judge in Southampton recently, and she asked what I did, and I kind of said, and she goes, you know, I used your technology to marry a couple on their deathbed during COVID, when no one could go out. That's value. That's what software accomplishes, and that's what we have to focus on. That's what we're going to be going through today. Specifically, when we think about the actual achievements, when we look at the past year, 2022, we measure things like how many lines of code we prevented from being created. So line of code equivalencies, what would it have taken to write it in Java? And how many millions of lines of code? So 188 million lines of code this year were prevented from being created due to the work you, our customers, have been doing and our partners have been doing using Uncork. When you think about my budget, I used to manage $1.2 billion a year spent. 80% of that was spent on nothing but keeping the lights on. The amount of technical debt we were dealing with on a daily basis, and every new system going live creating technical debt, was insane. So when we think about what we accomplished this year, almost $700 million of technical debt prevented from being done. That's not like, hey, new systems created. That's what it would have taken to support existing software to be able to do this without Uncork. And of course, 500,000 hours of code prevented, like those individuals could focus on algorithms, the important things, the things they should be creating, not moving a button around a screen. Like my favorite image in LinkedIn is, you know, she posts, I just graduated Stanford in computer science and I spent 2 days moving a button around a screen. That's the reality of software development where we've been. So where are we going? So a year ago today, we launched where we saw the future going, called Codeless architecture. New concept. An architecture, not a tool. I hated this concept that Uncork was being positioned as a new tool in a tool belt within a bigger tool shed. That's not how we saw ourselves. That's not how our customers were using Uncork. So when we think about where we're going, a year ago, we created the concept of looking at our customers' use of Uncork. It was actually an architecture. It was principles. It was design. It required system design thinking and engineer thinking, even if a business was actually hands on keyboard and driving the work. So we created Codeless architecture, and when you think about Codeless architecture, what it enabled us to do is to step back and say, we could assemble things. We could actually build things without code. Codeless, truly codeless, no code generated. You're going to hear me say this a lot. No code generated, no code allowed inside of our box. Definition, number one, and we'll see that later on. When we also step back and we're in this rocket ship together and you look down, what we see is a world where the business, and we're going to be hearing from the most incredible leaders today on the business side very shortly, the business knows why they need to do something. Why? Why is this important for the shareholders? Why is this important for our company? Why do we need to get this done now? Why is this a priority? The IT on this other side of this big cavern knows the how. All the complexities. And that's where I lived. I lived on that side. I knew how many services it would require, how many databases would change, thinking through that deployment, how many change releases this would do. This gap in between of what they need to do we've attempted for 30 years to fill using methodologies. From the waterfall of the old days to the agile of the new days. Hey, business, come meet with us 10 minutes a day and tell us if we're on the right track. It doesn't work because the technology has never been there until Uncork to bring them both together. So the way we see Uncork is a single platform enabled by codeless architecture, whereby business and IT together are creating software. So the agenda today, very simple. We're going to hear from the business, and again, the most amazing leaders who I've respected, I go to for advice, I sit down and ask questions. We're going to hear from, in my mind, the top technologists after them. And then what we're going to hear from at the end of the day is a panel who is federating both of those throughout their companies. The most amazing thing to me are the companies that are speaking here on the stage today, or what I've viewed when I was a CIO and looked up to as the future. They're the ones spending money and investing in technology, and they know where the future is going. So we're honored to have that here today as we go forward. When you think about codeless architecture, the center of codeless architecture, as we published this last year, is what we call a codeless definition. The concept is simple. 100% of your functionality, 100% of your application and your software is stored in a single open standard readable JSON file. Not a declarative language, not a custom language that we've invented. It's opened up. You have access to it today. And the reason we opened this up a year ago was because we started to see our customers do some very interesting things. Very large Fortune 10 healthcare company took all of their logic from their mainframe and generated that codeless definition automatically from their systems, allowing their business partners to drag and drop and create A/B testing on UI, digital. We've seen that with another reinsurance company. Take all of their reinsurance rules and generate that JSON file from their systems. We've seen ourselves how we could point Unqork at any system. The biggest names you could mention in the industry, reverse it into Unqork with no code. But the most important thing about this codeless architecture is it's your IP. That definition, that result is yours. And it is then built, run, and managed by Unqork. So continuing forward a little bit, what I want to unveil is a year later, we've seen codeless architecture in action. You, our customers in the rocket ship, have been fueling us and saying, we want to manage Unqork ourselves. We want full transparency into it as a service. We want to understand the logging, the rules. We want to see what's happening, the execution. It's cloud agnostic. We get it, so we don't need to worry about anything below the clouds. That's great. But we want to basically take control of that. And so with that, we stepped back and we said, this is no longer about a tool in your tool belt. This isn't about an architecture principle, which it is. It's about codeless as a service. And today, we're excited to have you here today as we launch codeless as a service. There was the first reporter picked it up, I think this morning. We've already seen one article. It is a category. It's a category. It hasn't existed before. However, we're not basing this on anything that's like brand new, because reality is we've been doing this for 5 years. It's been our journey. The reality is we see codeless architecture taking off where serverless architecture left off. Serverless architecture basically said, hey, software, you abstract away the hardware. Anyone ever walk into a data center? In about 10 years ago, you walked in, every single machine was different. I remember getting the call that my app was down, and I'd pray there was a part in stock. I remember the actual list of upgrades coming and patches coming, and a second that security vulnerability came, do I need to get a patch? What does that mean? When am I going to get the patch? What does DR testing look like? What does data retention look like? What does security look like? Reliability or resiliency? The ilities. And the reality is, today, if you walk into a data center, everything should be standard. You need compute. You don't care about the compute. Is it Intel or AMD, 64 CPUs, 32? Is it Linux or Intel? Doesn't matter. You basically need compute. Software has enabled us to basically abstract it away. You shouldn't think anymore. That's cloud. Serverless became cloud. What didn't happen is the one box, which is applications. The way you create software, the way you build your software hasn't changed since punch card machines. You're still communicating in someone else's language, telling a machine what to do. The second you write that code, it sits in someone else's container. The second that container is built and run, it's stale. It's insecure. It can't be upgraded. It's dependent on a parent environment. So when you think about applications, what we did in Unqork was we tackled applications. We took it to the next level. And applications is where 80% of your spend is going. That's your end-of-life issues. That's your technical debt issues. That's keeping everything operational. With that, when you break down an application, what we did is we broke down software into data. That JSON file that's the center of codeless architecture is nothing but data. It's data. It's readable. I've got a field. It's a text box. It's 9 characters. It's social security number. To bring down software into data, you need to understand presentation. You need to be able to do a pixel-perfect presentation. We are the proudest company to be invisible in the world. You will never know it's us. The example of getting married in New York City, you wouldn't have known it's us. That's an example. So pixel-perfect presentation, the presentation has to be abstracted away from your application logic. Today, it's a one-on-one. It's basically your presentation, your frameworks, your Angular, your React, your frameworks are all built into this. Has to be removed, and we've removed it. When you think about workflow, it's not a separate tool. It's not a concept. Hey, we need a workflow tool to connect operations to compliance. And the reality is email has become that tool because no tool has worked in the past before us. So workflow needs to be real world, needs to basically be able to satisfy human to machine back and forth. Rules engine needs to be something which is readable, understandable, and self-testing. So anyone could define a business rule, whether it's the business. So we have some clients who have basically said, hey, business, your job is to go into Uncork and maintain all of our KYC rules. You do all the onboarding rules. We, IT, will do everything else. We'll do the integration, that handoff. The rules need to be something which is self-documented and contained. Integration. We tried every integration tool you could imagine. We built our own. 50% of production deployments on Unqork today are using Unqork as a headless operation. They're calling us and saying, do something. We also built the outgoing ourselves because we couldn't find any integration as a service or any integration tool that actually worked in the real world. So we built it ourselves, and that's been there since 2017. It's how we talk to every system imaginable behind your firewall today, and works. ETL is about transforming data. Drag and drop, I have inputs. We've built a 4-way trade reconciliation for a bank using drag and drop. You don't need a recon tool. It's just an ETL process. It should be built into the concept. Data management, I'm going to skip because we're going to get back to this in a minute. Security has to be trusted. And you'll see in a minute when we talk about this. We are SOC 2, Type 2 privacy shield, GDPR compliant, Privacy 2020, HIPAA compliant, WORM compliant, ISO compliant. We've got FedRAMP pending, and I think we're about a week or two away from announcing full FedRAMP certification. You build an app, that's where you start. That's not where you leave off. If you ever generated code, I've never met a CIO when I went to them and said, do you want a code generator? And the answer is yes. However, 90% of the software trying to accelerate delivery in digital is code generators today. Not a single code generator could basically answer the question is, how do you keep it secure for the future? How do you remove technical debt? SDLC and versioning has to be built in. Has to be compliant with your processes, your change board, your deployment process, all built in. Monitoring and logging has to be something you could access to understand how is your application performing and how do you tune it. With that said, the most important thing of codeless architecture and codeless as a service is this. If your application is defined in our codeless definition, every single component around it could change throughout the future. Every single component. So we've removed and removing Angular because it's end of life with React. You don't even know it's occurring. We're swapping out rules engines. You don't understand it's occurring. We could swap out the SendGrid email with something else. You wouldn't know it occurred. There could be a brand new device form factor from Apple next year. Great, we'll build it. You don't even have to worry about it. Your application works perfectly. The tech debt has become our responsibility as it always should as opposed to our customers' responsibility. You should never be frozen. You're going to hear from Bassam, our CTO, soon how we're replacing the entire runtime engine next year. You won't even know it occurred. Seamless as we go through this. This is the future of technology. This is, when you think about cloud, you don't know a server was replaced, CPU was removed, part was upgraded. You should never even understand you had an impact. It should be seamless. We built that at the application level, bringing it up to the next level. With that said, I had an amazing conversation recently with someone who's the best category designer, and he pointed out to me, it can't be called this. Like, codeless? It can't be called. Why? Because you're telling me what it's not. It's not code. He also then went on to say, but you're following in some pretty amazing footsteps. So Henry Ford didn't call it automobile, he called it the horseless carriage. He had to tell people what it was not. The wireless telegraph was the radio. The wireless phone, smartphone, serverless became cloud. So what I'm asking each of you today is to help us name it. So specifically, if you do the QR code, you will come to an Unqork app where you could submit ideas, vote, uplift. Whoever is the winner of the category definition will join me at the Shed Gala that John mentioned, with their guest to celebrate. And this will push the category creation to where it needs to be. So specifically, what does it mean to be a category? We answered another app. We built another Unqork app, which you'll get a link to, that you could use to test your current software. You could look at your current software and say, does it meet these conditions? So number one is no software should ever generate code. One of the top accelerators, according to research groups, is a .NET code generator. The next one is a Java code generator. If you ask the CIO or engineer if you're generating code, they probably didn't even know that. First off, Unqork does no code generation. It's an interpreter. And as I mentioned, high speed, high performance. What it means is that each of you using Unqork is on the same version as each other. It means that when one client pen tests Unqork, you've benefited everyone else. When the next client pen tests, that same day, they benefited the previous client and everyone coming in the future. That concept has never existed in software before us. So when you think about the concepts you're going to see here, number one, code generation, never should generate code. Number two, if it's not a code generator, does it let me inject code in their own custom language? You could think of a CRM tool, an ERP tool. You could throw in insurance suites there. As soon as you write custom code in their language, you're locked into them. I think it was a great example when Log4j security vulnerability hit this year, and everyone called us and said, are you impacted? And we said, absolutely not, and you're not. Every single company that lets you write code basically said, we don't know if you're impacted because you might have written some code to use that functionality. They couldn't tell you for sure. There's even some technologies that they're talking about using AI to understand what the engineer wrote in their system. Because it's data, we could do some pretty amazing things with Uncork. Should be cloud agnostic. You shouldn't be locked into any single cloud provider. We're multi-cloud today. The application should not generate tech debt because it should be our responsibility, not yours. And finally, the application should be Turing complete. What I mean by that is Unqork Marketplace is an Unqork app. The Unqork UDLC concept, which is the entire way you deploy, version, test, manage, see your logs, RBAC, every aspect, is an Unqork app. We've been using Unqork to build Unqork for quite some time. And I think maybe I'll add one more question since it's an Unqork app. I think Nick in the background could do this in a minute, but would be, could the CEO actually use their software to build what you need?